Hey everyone, sorry I'm a couple minutes late. I was busy typing in another window and then happened to see that it is 7:02. So thank you for joining me tonight. We are talking about how temperature affects soap making tonight. So have you ever had soap that overheated and cracked or refused to trace at all? Tonight, I'm going to tell you why temperature is one of the most overlooked, but most important factors in soap making. If you happen to be a cook like me who just throws stuff in the pot, doesn't really think about, measuring and mixing and checking temperatures and stuff, making soap could be a real challenge because you've got to get over that idea that oh, the quantities don't really matter that much and that doesn't matter that much, because in soap making it's chemistry and it all matters. It's all very important. So I actually learned this very early on. Thankfully, I did learn to make soap from somebody else who stressed the importance of the temperature to me. But then within a few years, I found myself dressing up in an 1860s work dress and making soap for a historic farm festival every summer for several years. And we took some of our sheep, goats, and chickens, and my daughter sat there all day spinning wool, and I spent the day making soap. And that is how I learned the importance of temperature. So it's very interesting because I was out there in the middle of a farm, like under a nice shady tree. And so I would start the day with two coolers. One cooler had about 4 bottles of oils in them. So it had, what I would do, this was a very long day for me. I would get up very early in the morning and I would melt the oils for 4 batches of soap. So I would melt the coconut oil and the palm oil and the cocoa butter, and then I would add the olive oil to that, and I would put it in a jug, a plastic jug, and stick it in the cooler so that it would stay warm. And in the other cooler, I had all of my frozen goat milk. And it was really fascinating to see how the soap making experience changed throughout the day. Because I would get started and the temperature of everything was perfect. The milk was just starting to thaw just the tiniest bit, so it was easy to break up. And the oils were the nice warm temperature, 110 degrees or so that they needed to be. I would heat them up a little bit more so that they would be, a little warmer before I got, because it was an hour away to get to this place. And so that first batch of soap would just go beautifully. It would set up textbook perfect. And as the day went on, the frozen milk would thaw more and the oils would get progressively cooler with each batch. And so I saw how the results changed as those temperatures of the water or the goat milk and the oils changed. And by the end of the day, I had oils that were almost, well, I would say room temperature, except I was outside. So they were almost the ambient temperature outside. And I was mixing them with this goat milk that was very, very slushy at that point, and not frozen at all. So if you were in last night's, or if you've been in some of the previous talks, you may have heard me say that if your goat milk is not frozen, the warmer the goat milk is, the more likely you are going to wind up with the milk sugars burning. And instead of getting this really pretty pastel yellow when you add the lye to the milk, it's going to be an angry orange color, and your butter fat's going to separate, and you'll have these white floating things on the top that scare people and make them think that it's lye, but really it's just the butter fat that has separated because the temperature is too high. So it was quite different. However, luckily they did all eventually turn into soap. And so that's also how I learned that even if you've got that angry orange, as long as you're using a stick blender, and that is something I have not talked about this week, but I have a YouTube video about equipment for soap making. And I also go over equipment very thoroughly in my soap making course. So you really, really need to use a stick blender if you are making soap, because if you don't use a stick blender, it will literally take you many, many hours to get your soap to trace. And I know this because I have a friend who was making soap 5 or 6 years longer than me. And she was using a spoon, and she kept saying, I need to find a recipe that'll trace faster, because it took me 4 hours last night to make a batch of soap because I was stirring for so long. And I said, you need to use a stick blender. And she didn't believe me. And so she kept using a spoon for years until finally she complained about it one day on Facebook. And several people said, you need to be using a stick blender. So she finally got the stick blender and was like, oh my gosh, you can get trace in 5 minutes with a stick blender. Whereas it was taking her hours to stir it with a spoon to reach trace. So the stick blender is really, really important. And saponification. So let's get back to the science of temperature. Saponification, which is what happens when you mix lye with oils, they saponify, so they are no longer lye and oils, but instead they are saponified. And so instead of having like lye and coconut oil, you now have sodium cocoate. And instead of lye and palm oil, you now have sodium palmate. And instead of lye and olive oil, you now have sodium olivate. So that is what happens when those things combine. And saponification is an exothermic reaction, which means that it produces heat. So that's why when you mix everything together and it reaches trace and then you put it into your mold, it's going to heat up in that mold. Now, there are some things you can do that will cause it to heat up more. And if it heats up more, either if you are working with temperatures in your pot that are too hot, that can accelerate trace. So trace is when it looks like a runny pudding. And that's when you want to pour it into the mold, is when it reaches trace. So if it's too warm, that is going to accelerate trace. So like if you've got your oils at 120 degrees, you're going to get trace much faster than if you've got your oils at 105 degrees. And that could be bad if it happens too suddenly and you're a new soap maker and you're not expecting it, because it can go from a runny pudding to mashed potatoes sometimes within a minute if it's really too hot. The addition of some essential oils can also do that. A lot of fragrance oils can do that. And this is one of the reasons, I have many reasons why I do not use fragrance oils. This is one of the reasons I do not use fragrance oils, is because fragrance oils, you don't know what you're getting, because they are made in a lab and they are proprietary ingredients. And so you don't know what to expect unless another soap maker tells you. Like maybe you'll see a review on a site that says that, this fragrance oil accelerated trace and caused my soap to seize. But otherwise, fragrance oils, you really don't know what to expect with them in terms of what they're going to do, in terms of how fast your soap is going to trace or not. With essential oils, the only two we have ever had a problem with are cinnamon and wintergreen. The cinnamon, I knew ahead of time because I had heard from multiple soap makers that cinnamon essential oil is very challenging. So I have never made a batch with just cinnamon essential oil. What we have done with cinnamon is that we mix it with orange essential oil. I talked about last night I talked about blending oils. So there's two reasons that I blended that. Last night I talked about the fact that if you use citrus oils, they tend to fade really fast unless you anchor them with a stronger oil. And cinnamon would be that stronger oil. So my cinnamon orange soap that scent lasts for a really long time. People say it smells like red hot candy. So that's one reason it's one of my best sellers. But the thing is, cinnamon is tricky. So don't do this as your first soap batch. Get about a dozen batches of soap completed successfully before you attempt to use cinnamon. And then, like I said, I've never made a batch of 100% cinnamon. I've always mixed it with another essential oil. And so there's not as much cinnamon in there, so it's not going to trace as fast. It still traces faster, but not as fast. I did not know anybody who had ever used wintergreen, but I wanted to use wintergreen because I love that scent. And unfortunately, my husband was the unlucky person who was teaching a soap making class in person. And when we teach our soap making classes, we are making soap for sale during the class. So it's not like the soap gets wasted or anything. And so the fragrance that we use, or the essential oil that we use, is whatever we need to use. And I had just bought this wintergreen essential oil and told my husband, hey, use this for the class. Okay, that was a mistake. He was not happy. Then he's in the middle of a class and he uses an oil for the first time and it starts to seize. It was a great lesson for the students because they got to see what it looks like and how to respond. But it was a little bit nerve-wracking for him. So too much heat can accelerate trace, and too little heat can stall the reaction and you might not get trace at all. And so the oils, and both oils and lye have temperatures that influence the reaction speed. And I want to throw in here, I don't know that I see this as much now, but I know that like 15, 20 years ago, what you saw online a lot is people saying that your oils and your lye mixture have to both be exactly the same temperature. And there were so many soap making mistakes as a result of that. Like that is just complete nonsense. You could see from my experience in the park that my milk mixed with the lye and my oils were never the exact same temperature when I was doing those demos in the park for the historic farm event. And they all turned out. So I have heard of so many accidents when somebody heated up their oils and they mixed their lye with their liquid and they weren't exactly the same. And so one person set the lye pitcher of lye with liquid on her counter, and she was waiting for it to cool so that it would be at the same temperature as her oils. And her toddler reached up, grabbed it, and pulled it down on himself. And so his whole body was doused in lye. And she called 911 immediately, and his whole body had chemical burns all over it. It was one of the most harrowing stories I have ever heard. And then another situation that I heard of where somebody was trying to make their things the exact same temperature was that she mixed up her lye and it had cooled down too much after she mixed up her oils. And so she put the lye mixture in her microwave to heat it up more, and she blew up her microwave. Thank goodness she was not hurt, but her microwave was destroyed. So it is not important at all if these are exactly the same temperature. So if you nothing online ever dies. So those recipes and instructions are probably still out there somewhere. And if you see that, it is just nonsense and you can ignore it. The goal is to have stuff around 110 degrees. If you are working with something like cinnamon or wintergreen that you know is going to seize, you might want to work with that like at 105 degrees or 101 degrees. I go in my course, I go into a lot more detail about how to control the temperatures because that takes a lot more explanation. So tonight I'm really just talking about the theory and why you really need to be careful with those temperatures and make sure that they are right around that target zone of 110 degrees. So, but if your oils are 115 and your lye mixture is 105, that's totally fine. You put them together and, they're going to be right around that 110 degree goal that you're going for. So, let's see. I see one comment. Oh, Buster is just saying, thanks for all the information on goats you put out. You are welcome. Thank you for showing up tonight. So I will head back to the soap making outline. So all of this means, because you're like, well, how do I know? All of this means you need to have a thermometer. What you want to get, you don't want to get a candy thermometer because that reads temperatures that are really high because candy is done at really high temperatures. You just want a typical cooking thermometer. You can get a cheap little stem thermometer with a dial on it. Most grocery stores have those. They're really not very expensive, like maybe $5 or $10. And use that to check your temperatures. I use a binder clip, like this is a tiny one. Let me see if I put it in front of if you can see it a little better. So it's just like a little binder clip. I use the one that's a little bit bigger than this, but I hook that on the side of the pot and then put that stem through there so that the thermometer hangs into the pot, because there's going to be a little dimple on that stem and it needs to be below the dimple for it to register the correct temperature. So make sure that dimple is all the way down in there, because otherwise it's probably going to register low. And so you don't want to be sitting there making soap and thinking that it's not hot enough and just keep heating and heating and heating. And you're like, gee, why isn't the temperature going up? And then you realize that the thermometer is not in there far enough, and you take it and you stick it in there. You're like, oh my goodness, it's 140 degrees. And then you are in a situation where you need to cool it down before you use it. Because if you started mixing at 140 degrees, it would trace really fast and you would have a big mess on your hands because it would turn into mashed potatoes very quickly. And every soap maker has that happen at some point, and it is not fun at all. It's very stressful. And it's not something that you really want to deal with. So what can happen if it gets too hot after you pour it into the mold? And that can and you can wind up with cracking. Last night I mentioned briefly that, when I tried to use honey in my goat milk soap, that instead of being nice and flat like normal, it started to rise like a cake that's being baked, and it didn't fall. It stayed up like that, which I thought was really strange. Like, wow, it expanded. And when I started to slice it, I realized that it had a tunnel that went all the way through the whole loaf. So each bar of soap had a hole in it big enough that I could stick my pinky finger through. And the soap was perfectly fine. It worked. It was still soap, but every bar had a hole in it. So, and that happened because I added the honey, and honey makes it heat up. One of the things that happens sometimes is that people might, oh shoot, my phone is ringing. I'm trying to ignore it. Let's see. Lye and oil are too warm. Oh, okay. Another one of the things that I used to see, well, all the time when I got started, people were absolutely fanatical about insulating your mold. I mean, we're talking 20 years ago, the instructions that you found online from people about making soap all talked about, after you put your soap in the mold, wrap it in a quilt for 24 hours. Don't peek, not even an hour early. You'll ruin it. And that is really bad advice if you're making goat milk soap, because the goat milk is going to cause it to heat up more anyway. And so if you insulate it on top of that, then you could wind up with the tunneling and the cracking and all that kind of stuff. So there's no reason at all to insulate your soap if you are making goat milk soap. On the flip side, now we have people who are saying that you need to put your soap in the freezer to saponify, and that is not true either. The first time I heard this was from one of my University of Massachusetts students 7 or 8 years ago. And that is one of the most ridiculous things I have ever heard, because it's like, I couldn't have a soap making business if I had to have enough freezer space to put 7 loaves of soap in there for saponification. And it's not necessary. So I finally learned that got started by people who want to make these soaps that look like a work of art. And so if you get into making soap with all kinds of fancy colors that look like cupcakes and cake slices and really colorful things, that doing that kind of temperature control during saponification can be important for maintaining the exact perfect, beautiful, bright color that you want. So if you want to do that, that is not something that I do, because my soap is very functional. We want soap that is healthy for our skin. That's what our customers want. Our customers do not be a work of art, after you use the bar 4 or 5 times. And so our customers are very practical people who just want a nice, all natural soap that is going to be easy on their skin and get them clean. So your soap can saponify sitting right there on a table in the mold. You don't need to insulate it. You don't need to put it in the freezer or anything else extreme like that. So if you are adding honey or something else that can make it heat up more, remember that you do want to work with slightly cooler temperatures, like 105 instead of 110, maybe even 100. So if your soap is too cold, if it's not hot enough, it can take forever to reach trace. And that actually happened to me the first time that I made soap at that 1800s farm event in a park, because the temperatures got so close to just the ambient temperature. It was probably below 90 degrees, and I was standing there mixing. I never mixed so long in my life. And people would walk by and say, "Is it soap yet?" I'm like, "No, not yet. I'm still working on it." And they come by, like, "Is it soap yet?" "No, not yet." And normally we're talking like 4 or 5 minutes for it to trace. So the other thing is, I have heard people talk about false trace, and I'm not exactly sure how that happens, because it's never happened to me. But basically they think it's traced, and so they pour it into the mold, but it's not. And so then instead of saponifying, it separates, and it just gets really gross, and it's a big pile of goo, and it doesn't work. So you can save it, though, if that happens. Just put it all back in the pot, put it on a stove, and heat it up again. And that was my problem, being out in the middle of a park, historic farm, is that I didn't have a stove. There was no way I could heat it up again. And so if I didn't get it to reach trace, I was going to have to drive home with a pot of sloppy goo that had active lye in it, which is rather scary. So basically, so you also, I've never had this problem because we don't have our house too cold, but some people have talked about, like, if make sure that where you're working is over 70 degrees. If it's too cold, you could have problems. So I think, let's see, there is another question. Let's see. So going for 110 for both, but they don't actually need to be the same. What is the min max temps for oil mixtures and min max lye temperatures? So once they're mixed together, you really just want them to be so the target temperature is somewhere between, the textbooks say somewhere between 95 and 120. So that's why I said earlier, if one of them is your oils are most likely to be warmer. So if they're 115 to 120, that's fine. And if your milk mixture is down to 100 or 95, that's fine. And then you put them together. and they're going to be right there in the middle. I think my oils may have been a little warmer even sometimes. People always ask me, well, do you do XYZ? And I always tell people, I'm like, don't do what I do. When it comes to worms, I break a lot of the rules now because we no longer have worm problems. And when it comes to soap, I don't even know how many thousands of batches of soap that we have made in the last 23 years. So I am not using a thermometer anymore because we do everything exactly the same every time. And so I know that my temperatures are going to be in the right ballpark. But when you're new, you've got to have the experience to know that, and you need a thermometer to tell you. Marge said thermometers need to not be aluminum, which is absolutely true. In fact, nothing that comes in contact with lye can be aluminum. So like, you don't want to use aluminum pots or an aluminum spoon or an aluminum pitcher for mixing your lye. Nothing aluminum whatsoever. And I tend to be somebody who wants to try everything out for myself. But luckily, and I heard that early on, like lye and aluminum do not play nice together. And I got very lucky that one of the soap makers that I met, and in the beginning, I was going to soap making conferences and everything. I really immersed myself in the world of soap making to learn all about it. And one of the people I met said that she did not know that, and she was using an aluminum pot, and she was in the middle of a batch of soap, and black smoke started coming out of the pot because the lye and the aluminum were starting to react. And so that was really super scary for her, and she just dumped it down her sink, and thank goodness it all washed down just fine. But yeah, definitely nothing aluminum should ever come in contact with lye because that they do not play nice together. And I just briefly want to say that it is silly that so many people say, oh, you can't use you can't use your cooking thermometer for making soap. Yes, you can. It's metal. Like all the lye is going to wash off of the metal when you wash it. So, it's nothing to be afraid of. And like, I use exactly the same 8-cup, I use one of those 8-cup mixing bowl that has the pour spout and the handle. That's what I use to mix up my lye. And it is glass. Like glass is not going to absorb the lye. So, for 23 years and thousands of batches of soap, I have used the exact same 8-cup measuring cup pitcher for making pancakes as I do for making soap. And because it is glass, and so it completely gets washed up and stuff. I would not use anything porous, however, and I knew that. So like a wooden spoon or a plastic spatula, I would not use that for food and for lye. Not because it's going to hurt you, because I actually experienced this. I used a spatula. I reached in my drawer one day and pulled out a plastic spatula, and I was using it to frost a cake, totally frosted the cake. And when I was done, I licked the spatula and it felt like I was licking a bar of soap. It was really gross. Thank goodness that flavor did not transfer to the cake. But it was a very unpleasant experience for me. There was, of course, no active lye in that. It just wasn't pleasant. And so then it was like, okay, I got to find a way to make sure that my soap making spatulas do not get mixed in. And so I bought different colors. So that already tasted like soap. So it was a blue spatula. So the blue spatula was put in with all the soap making equipment, and I got white spatulas to use for regular kitchen stuff. So I am not seeing any more questions. Soap makes a fantastic gift. I got so into soap making in the beginning, and I started giving it to all my friends and relatives and stuff, and they thought it was so great and loved it so much. And then they started asking to buy it from me. So it's a great opportunity for you to see if there's any interest amongst the people you know in buying soap from you. So if you're watching this later and you've got any questions, feel free to post in the comment section below and we'll get back to you. Good night, everyone. This has been fun.